Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in London. Sir Richard Moore joins me today. He was the former head of the British Secret Service from 2020 to 2025, more formally known as MI6, of course. The culmination of a near 40-year career in intelligence and diplomacy. After postings around the world, he served as the Director General for Political Affairs in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and as Britain's ambassador to Turkey from 2014 to 2017. He is a graduate of Oxford University and Harvard's Kennedy School. Today, he is a senior advisor to Teneo and a senior strategist to the asset manager 6th Street, and he is a member of Bank of America's Global Advisory Council. So thank you, Richard, for joining me today. It's great to have you here again. So, as long as we've known each other, there's been a lot going on in the world, and I know that our audience
don't need to know each other for long, do you?
Exactly,
in the kids today's world.
The audience is going to want to hear your views on things like Iran and Russia, Ukraine, but I think it's important to start by sort of setting the table here a little bit with the big picture. I mean, it occurs to me that CEOs and boards and other corporate leaders are keeping a lot of balls in the air with this constantly evolving, constant influx of new events and news. But is the global operating environment, in your view, actually shifting, and are they as fully aware of that as they need to be?
Well, I think most CEOs probably are fully aware, aren't they? And geopolitics would have been sort of one of those issues that was there, it never goes away, and would have been one of those issues around the board table, I suspect, a few years ago. It's just the prominence of it now, isn't it? With all of everything that's happened with COVID, the pandemic, and then into these disruptions that we've seen first in Ukraine, now in Iran, to global supply chains. It's now right up there, isn't it? And I think AI on the one hand and other emerging technologies and geopolitical risk are just right there in full view. Because the world at the moment is, I have to say, after sort of 38 years in intelligence and diplomacy, this is the most disordered the world's been, I think. I think you can point to more dangerous moments during the Cold War. Cuban Missile Crisis, everyone knows about other moments as well. But in terms of, at least in the Cold War, particularly in the latter stages, there was some kind of guardrails. There was détente, there was arms control negotiations leading to agreements. And that feels lacking. The United Nations Security Council, which is supposed to do this job for the international system, is it's stalemated really between China and Russia on the one hand, and the US and its allies, UK and France, and other members of the UN Security Council. So for all those reasons, I think CEOs are trying to navigate a much more disordered world than they had to before.
So there's no issue of greater immediacy or economic impact right now than the Iran war, obviously. And that has picked up, even we've had this ceasefire that's now lasted far longer than the actual war itself, but it's a very fragile one. Ultimately, like all conflicts, it will be resolved by some sort of an agreement. I suspect we kind of understand what the contours of that might look like. But I do wonder what you think the consequences of this all are, and what the impact will be of these sort of unresolved issues, the regime being in place, some sort of nuclear enrichment capability, the ability to reconstitute their conventional arms, and their continued support for their proxy forces around the world, and this knowledge that they have the capability and potentially the will to close the Strait at, on demand, essentially. What's the consequences of all this, do you think?
I think there are just a number of consequences, some of which are only just really maturing fully, particularly in the economic dimensions of this. I mean, we're seeing it, and it's very variable, isn't it? There's a real variable geometry in terms of the impact economically. I think one of the issues here slightly is that probably the two countries that are not feeling the pain as much as others are probably the US and China. and they happen to be the two most important countries in the world. The US because of energy independence, which is a big difference from the oil crisis of the 1970s, for example. China because they did quite a lot of prudential stockpiling of fuel, and of course they've invested heavily in renewables. And so for those reasons there's a slight kind of I sense, a sort of sense that there's not the same urgency. Whereas if you're sitting in New Delhi or in Jakarta or bits of Africa, you're feeling a great sense of urgency and are desperate for this to be resolved. And as we're seeing, it's difficult to get it resolved, and it's been a ceasefire without fire ceasing much. Whether that's in Lebanon or the continued frictions we've seen recently in the last few days with the downing of a US helicopter and then the response from the US. So where do we go from here? It's very difficult. Clearly, it seems, despite some of the talk up front around regime change, I don't think there is an appetite to follow through in the way that happened in Iraq in 2003 or in Afghanistan post 9/11. So if that's not going to happen, we have the Strait of Hormuz, which are kind of, for the sake of the global economy, has to be released at some point. But you're right. I think Iran has discovered a very significant strategic weapon advantage, and that is its ability to close the straits against the mightiest navy in the world. And this is a reminder of just how asymmetry works in modern warfare. And in those circumstances, even if the straits are opened, as we would all wish, and it won't happen in some glorified ribbon cutting ceremony, but if it gradually increases the flow over time, Iran is not about to forget that it has that, and it won't allow us to forget that it has this ability to close the straits. So we are in a new paradigm. All the countries of the region are trying to work their way through. The Gulf states, I think, have proved commendably resilient through all this, but they've now got to think through what happens. There will be a negotiation. But that negotiation, like all negotiations, is going to have to lead to some compromise. The pressures on Iran are real. The blockade will be having an impact on Iran. But as there's a bit of a sort of game of chicken here between waiting for that to have the sort of impact on Iran which might lead them to open the straits, and the global economy, if it's left to run on for too long, getting into really serious difficulty. And that is the very uncomfortable space, I think, that you can see the US president trying to navigate his way through at the moment. And I think it's going to take time, it's going to run on.
Talking to veterans of the Defense Department in the United States and the intelligence community there, it's clear that the closure of the Strait was a scenario that decades of planning had gone into. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were the head of the Iran desk at MI6 for some time. I mean, do you think there was a fundamental, at the sort of the political level, misunderstanding of what the Iranian regime was willing to endure and willing to subject their own population to, that led to a miscalculation of what the initial assault would achieve?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, my former colleagues will I'll get in trouble if I don't correct you and say that I worked in our Iranian team if I first started in 1991, but I never had the distinction of leading what is a fantastic team. It's a great job to get. But look, I think what's happened here is sometimes people talk about a failure of intelligence. I think the intelligence on Iran is pretty good. Yeah. But it's a failure of empathy, perhaps. Because I think given that despite the talk of regime change, there wasn't a preparedness to go all the way, and that would have required boots on the ground. And in a post-Iraq world, that's difficult for anyone politically to embark upon. Because of that, I'm afraid, probably in some ways, the only people who might have believed the talk of regime change were the Iranian regime. It's a deeply paranoid regime that doesn't understand the United States or the broader West. And of course it had its leadership decapitated on the first day of hostilities. So for all those reasons, I suspect it did believe that regime change was on the cards, and therefore some of the taboos perhaps which have been in place to prevent it from attacking its neighbours at scale. It has attacked them before, but at the scale that we've seen in recent weeks, and of course critically, to break the taboo over the Straits of Hormuz, which are international waters. Iran, to be very clear, is not entitled to close them. But that's what's happened. And so I think, as you say, absolutely the militaries, the Western militaries will have thought this through, will have war gamed the scenario of the closure of the Straits. But I would say one thing. I really wonder whether we had fully internalized what the Ukrainians had done in the Black Sea. Remember, this is a country that had a negligible navy, if any, and yet they managed, through a brilliant innovation in the use of seaborne drones, to drive the Russian Navy away from Crimea and right to the eastern end of the Black Sea. And here we have in the Gulf a better equipped, much more effective Navy in the US Navy, but it is contending with exactly the same asymmetric threat. And it's, you can see it's really difficult. You can't just force your way through as the current disposition of forces is. And I wonder if not only did we misjudge how resilient the Iranian regime would be, but we hadn't fully internalized the way that warfare had evolved. As we all know, the Iranian Navy is at the bottom of the sea, but that hasn't taken away the drones and the ability to.
Right. And it strikes me that as we saw in the recent meetings between President Trump and President Xi Jinping in China, where both sides talked about Taiwan to a certain degree, not to each other necessarily, but in separate. But that between the two of them, they had the fate of the island in their hands, and yet Ukraine and Iran remind us that the smaller countries actually have quite a big vote in how things play out. You bring up Ukraine, and in the United States at least, the Iran conflict has kind of relegated Ukraine a bit to the back pages, but the death rates in this war continue to be just absolutely atrocious, and yet there's no real movement of the front lines, no real winning or losing going on here, though we seem to be seeing some of the early cracks in Russia that we haven't seen almost throughout this conflict, and even within the urban elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg and the like. But in this kind of, the conflict has also evolved from just the front lines. Obviously, they're attacking each other's capitals to a degree, but there's this increased hybrid warfare into Europe from Russia, and now even some drones that continue to fall into NATO territory and the like. Is Russia at war with Europe / the West in a way that is underappreciated by those, and how dangerous is this in your view?
It's very dangerous, and I feel very, very strongly that Ukraine is the main effort. And one of my slight concerns about Iran and the campaign against Iran, given the rather confused war aims, is that we're not focusing on the contest of wills with Putin. And it is really important for the Western alliance as a whole, including, I would argue, for the United States, that we don't fail this contest in Ukraine. Not only would it embolden Putin if we did, to the detriment of European security for sure, but I think it's in all our interests that we continue to ensure that the Ukrainians come off best in this. They're not, I don't think, and I don't think President Zelensky or anybody else in Ukraine thinks that they're going to drive the Russians out of all the territory. President Zelensky, wants a ceasefire. He's prepared de facto to give up 20% of his country to achieve a ceasefire. The person who's not been prepared to come to the table is Putin. And that is because up until now, Putin has felt that he could win. And he's been told by his generals that, just one more shove, Mr. President, and we'll get there. I think the Ukrainians are rather proving that that's not the case. And they do have the edge, I think, in drone warfare on the front line with brilliant, innovative work. These long-distance strikes are having a real impact. You can see some of the logistics of the Russians really struggling to support their forces in the Crimea, for example, as well as some of the production further away. So that's having an impact. And then critically, and I think it'll be the thing that brings Putin to the negotiating table to actually negotiate, is your point that this is starting to reach the middle class of Moscow and St. Petersburg, who up to now have been able to pretend there wasn't a war on. The people being sent to fight and die have come from the regions of Russia, often ethnic minorities, poorer, needing the money, frankly, and it didn't touch the middle classes. This is starting now to impact on them. And I think we will look back on that parade, the annual military parade, May the 9th, to celebrate the victory over Nazi Germany, and the fact that there was unable to be a parade effectively will be a point that we'll look back on and say that was probably the point at which Putin's ability to withstand the pressure to come to a negotiating table started to change.
Both the Ukraine war and the Iran war have exposed some of the political differences between the European powers and UK and say the United States. But at an institutional level, the intelligence community, has it had any impact on the cooperation, particularly between the Five Eyes and CIA and the like?
I left the job some months ago now, Kevin, so I can't I can't comment with any great accuracy on the last few months, but my sense is that it has remained unaffected. I mean, clearly there is some tension going on within the alliance, and we've seen that over issues like Greenland and other things, and I'm not going to gainsay that, it's clearly a factor. And intelligence relationships are never entirely insulated from that sort of wider turbulence, but they are to a large degree. And that's not because there's a sort of a outgush of sentiment or of charitable giving. That's not how these operate. These are ultimately, they're based on shared values, undoubtedly true, but they're transactional. They have to deliver for all parties. Five Eyes is a great example. I mean, those five are massively different in scale and size. New Zealand at the smaller end and the US very clearly at the bigger end. But all five gain from this. United States gains from the fact that all of those other countries are supporting them, that we have if you like, a follow the sun capability because of the geography of the Five Eyes across the continent. So my sense is that there's a lot of determination on both sides to keep it going. I had an excellent relationship with Bill Burns under the Biden administration, and John Ratcliffe became a firm friend very quickly and absolutely appreciated what the UK brought to the party, and nothing that I've heard or seen suggests that has changed.
I do want to talk about the evolution of the intelligence community in general and MI6 in particular, but you brought up China a moment ago, and I do think it's worth looking at that a little bit more carefully, because in a way, it embodies where this evolution has to occur. Because for the longest time, during the Cold War, obviously, the strategic adversary was one that was completely cut off, essentially, from the world economically and commercially, meaning the Soviet Union, of course. But China, the great pacing challenge to the United States and to the West today, is also fully integrated into the global economy. So what kind of a challenge does that pose for the intelligence services and for policymakers as well?
Yeah, that integration point is so important. The People's Republic of China is so much more massively integrated into the world economy than the Soviet Union ever was.
Yeah.
So that gives them a stake in the system. So I've always been really careful. I've said publicly that for MI6 during my tenure, the issue on which we devoted more resources than any other was China. And that's because China is very big, very important, and rather opaque to read in terms of what's happening there and what decisions are being taken, what capabilities are being developed. But I've always been pretty balanced on this. I think it's important that on the one hand we engage with China, world trade, the binding in of parties is an important stabilizer, and we shouldn't throw that away. And it's important for our national prosperity that we all trade with China. If we're going to tackle the big issues of the global commons, the issues of climate change, the issues of agentic AI and how we ensure we get the benefits but manage the downside and the risks, then we have to have a dialogue, particularly between Washington and Beijing. And so I was pleased to see the president go to Beijing and beginnings of conversations on those sort of issues.
You know, you brought up AI a moment ago, and obviously we're living in a world where every institution is dealing with how they're going to work with it and how they're going to compete with it. And we're also living in a world where there's increased surveillance, technological disruption all over the place. So talk a little bit about the importance in this modern, the contemporary world still of human intelligence sources versus signals intelligence. I know that everybody talks about CIA, but NSA in the U.S. is a much bigger organization.
Sure.
I suppose the same is true with MI6 and GCHQ here.
It is.
But what's the role and value still of human intelligence in this operating environment?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear me being a defender of human intelligence, and I'll come back to that in a second. But just to set the frame here, it's very clear that command of the key emerging technologies in AI, in biotechnology, in quantum, are going to be a key determinant of national strength, and so. It is important for us in the West that we end up, I think, maintaining a lead in these areas. So I used to think about the technology, and I coined sort of 3 T's. So the 3 T's are that technology has become a target. It's an important collection requirement for the agencies to understand where other countries, particularly China, have got to in their advances on these technologies. It's a tool. We are using it a lot. If you think about the nature of human intelligence, where you have to try and identify people who might, those brave men and women who might be prepared to come and help MI6, then AI, of course, enables you to shred through and dissect data at pace and perhaps identify people who might be able to help you. So it's powerful and useful. And then it's a threat, because by the nature of our business, you are trying to keep secret the relationships you have with these men and women. And AI combined with ubiquitous technical surveillance poses a threat to that. So it means that MI6 and CIA are continually having to innovate and stay ahead in human intelligence. But I would argue, while a human remains in the loop, and we must all hope that we manage the benefits of AI in a way that does keep the human in the loop, and that human is making the key decisions, you want human sources who can help you to interpret that, both report what may be being discussed, but also it usually helps a lot with intent and and being able to give you that sense of what's going on. So I don't think we're about to die out anytime soon.
Talk a little bit about the Iran war and the Ukraine war have both proven stark terms that the impact of the war goes way beyond the theater of kinetic activity, right?
Absolutely.
And especially as we move more into cyber warfare and the AI component that you've just been talking about and so on and so forth, that the battlefield is increasingly going to be in the private sector. They have the assets, they have the IP that is going to be contested and the like. So what's the appropriate, or should there be an evolving relationship between, say, the intel community as a proxy for the governments and corporate America or corporate Britain for that matter? We know intel was declassified and analysis was declassified ahead of the Russia-Ukraine war. Not every company took advantage of that, but some did and were well prepared when that war started. But what's the appropriate level of interaction?
This is such a great question, and it's so vital. You referred earlier, and I didn't pick it up, but I should have done, about Putin's pursuit of hybrid war. And of course, that doesn't stay neatly restricted to governmental organizations or institutions. We found out recently that the Russians were trying to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall.
Yes.
They have been trying to damage civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure. So even if they didn't want to be, so to speak, the private sector is in this fight. They are a target. And I would like to turn that, so they obviously deserve to get support and help from the institutions of the state, and I hope they do get that, from cybersecurity all the way through to being briefed on intelligence appropriately to ensure they can manage their security. If you look at China, clearly when we talk about those emerging technologies, there is a whole of society effort, and the leading tech companies ultimately take their instructions from the state. Now, we do not have that system, but if we're going to compete with that pacing challenge that we have from China, then we have to find a way of partnering more effectively with the private sector, not least because compared, say, to the 40s or 50s, when a lot of innovation spun out of the defense sector,
Right.
the reverse is the true now. All the great innovation largely is coming out of the private sector. So we have to find a way of doing that more effectively. I said when I was chief that we in the intelligence communities have to also change a bit our approach and our culture if we're going to compete and keep up with the sort of threats to our operating model, I was saying. And I said there's a paradox here, that in order to stay secret in the things that really count around your operations and your agents, you've got to be more open in terms of your partnership with the private sector.
So that's a good segue to, now that you've moved out of government service and into the private sector, you're advising Teneo and its clients, and I'm kind of interested to hear how you're finding that and what you're being asked about. And of particular interest to me is I know you're also a senior strategist at Sixth Street, which for those who aren't familiar with it, it's $125 billion alternative asset management. I have my own personal views about that company at the moment because I'm a New Yorker, and I know they own a big chunk of the San Antonio Spurs, but once I will go back to studied neutrality on Sixth Street once the Knicks close this out. But talk a little bit about how you're making your way with the private sector and what you're being really asked about.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Teneo is in the space of advising CEOs, and as we said right at the outset of the podcast, CEOs are really trying to think through geopolitical risk. So I'm doing that, and I'm doing a bit of that, of course, with Sixth Street, and because they are an increasingly global company. I think your figure is probably slightly under. It's about 135 billion now, but increasingly going beyond the States. And so I think they needed a bit of help, they felt, in helping them to interpret some of that stuff. And secondly, I think apart from the geopolitical stuff, I ran a risk business. MI6 ultimately is a risk business. It's about judging some potentially very risky operations where the downside risk is severe if you get it wrong,
right,
against the upside of providing absolutely brilliant, exquisite intelligence, which can, in some cases, save lives or help your government to manage a serious international crisis. So some of those approaches to thinking about risk, how you create a culture within an organization where you have a good deal of entrepreneurism and you support risk-taking. On the other hand, you have to stay compliant, you have to stay within the law, the British law of MI6. Some of that translates rather well into an investing climate.
Sure.
They're always trying to measure up risk against reward. They're trying to build relationships of trust with their, the people who give their money to them to invest, and the people they invest in, the companies such as the hopefully soon to be triumphant San Antonio Spurs. Probably by the time this goes out, we'll know who got that one right.
On that. Yeah.
I know we're in a 3-1 hole. Very good.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, so I thought we'd do a lightning round of some fun questions. Obviously,
great.
You are Sir Richard Moore. Britain's most famous spy was once played by Sir Roger Moore. True or false, you guys are related?
We're not related, no. But I have been called Roger consistently throughout my career, often by people who, it's obviously subliminal, they have no idea they're doing it.
And throughout the Bond films and books, the boss of the Secret Service of MI6 was referred to as M, but in reality, that person is known as C. Now, could Ian Fleming just not spell, or what's the origin story behind C?
So C comes, a lot of people think it comes from Chief, but it doesn't actually. It comes from the very first Chief, who was a chap who was pulled in from retirement. He was doing boom defense, former naval officer, brought in to be Chief in 1909, and he was called Mansfield Cumming, and he signed himself with a big C in green ink, as per the Royal Navy tradition. And we've continued to use the C, continue to use the green ink. The one where in fact, life imitates art is Q, where Fleming came up with Q for the technical wizardry and the wizards, yes. The gadgetry, etc. in the films. And when we were doing a reorganization a few years ago of our technical operations team, we thought, oh, what the hell? So we called them Q.
Well, I know there's not a lot of fiscal space in the British Treasury, but I do hope that your spies are all running around in Aston Martins at all times with, with ejector seats and the like.
Would it were the case?
Do you have a favorite spy film series or book series? And on the reality on the inside, where is it really on the spectrum between the sort of the glamour of Bond and that kind of concept of institutional rot in a way that underpins the John le Carré?
Or perhaps Mick Herron's The Slow Horses
yes,
a bit as well. Sort of, look, I mean, it's a funny thing to admit, but I absolutely adore spy novels and the series. They are fiction. I once got sort of told off by Mick Herron because I praised so highly his books, and he said he doesn't know I make it up, doesn't he? And I do, I promise, Mick, I do know that. But look, very few of them, I think, reflect the reality very much. Bond is wonderful and gives us a kind of marketing reach that many companies, I'm sure, that Teneo advisors would die for.
Absolutely.
But I tell you the one that I think hits the spot closest. It's all concertinaed in timing, it's a bit exaggerated. But I have to give credit, it's a French series. It's The Bureau.
Yes.
Which, if you look in the credits at the end, you'll see that our brilliant partners, the DGSE, gave them a bit of advice. And the scenarios in that, I think, are not too far away from some of the things I found myself doing.
Well, there you have it. I want to thank Sir Richard Moore for joining me today. That's it for this edition of Teneo Insights. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in London. Have a great day.